Make sure this is muted before we get going. Okay. What we're going to explore over our next period together is what we call culture and social behavior. This combines two closely related fields of psychology, cross-cultural psychology and social psychology. Okay. And what social psychology, its most basic definition is our behaviors and our mental processes as it relates to the influence of other people. So this is very much related to cultural psychology in that we're interested in how the attitudes, belief systems, and behaviors of a group influence individual behavior. But when we take it to the cross-cultural level, we're looking at even the broader perspective. What is it about a culture? How is it influenced by the behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes of the group? So it's a little bit broader than the specific study of social psychology, but is very related to what we want to talk about. Okay. And one of the major areas of interest in understanding the social world and is, of course, interpersonal communication. Okay. And of course, this is where we can talk about things such as language, use of words, use of written language. But we also talk about what is called the context versus the content of cultural orientation. So when we look at context, we look at differences in level and tone of voice. So there are some cultures that tend to have a very boisterous voice, and there's some cultures that tend to have a very calm voice. Looking or not looking into the eyes, we will see that eye contact differs among cultures. Some of them are unwritten rules of eye contact, and some of them are clearly explicit rules. So, for example, when we look at some of the Eastern countries, uh, female eye contact to a male superior specifically is forbidden. And we can see this in some Eastern nations as well. In some of these are dictated by religion. In some of these, they're dictated by rule of law. In others, that's this just dictated by social norms or what one should be doing versus what one should not be doing. Okay. And then, of course, here in Western culture, eye contact is encouraged because it shows a sign of respect. Okay. But those aren't, again, when we talk about Western psychology, these are not written rules of interaction. They're kind of this expectation that you should do when you should be paying specific attention to a specific person. Distance between the body. Okay. This, again, there's cultural differences. There's some cultures that you're very close with. And if we look at, for example, you would think Russian culture, because the Western society paints Russians as very cold and very offish. They actually don't maintain too much personal space. They come into very close contact, and that's normal for them. In other cultures, like the Western culture, we have what's kind of the unofficial arm length rule that once you get within an arm length width of somebody, especially a stranger, you're violating what's called their body space or their space. Okay. And usually within our culture, we look for permission in a sense, either verbally or non-verbally, to give someone we don't know very well, for example, a hug or a handshake. We look for those non-verbal behaviors, where in other cultures, close contact is a norm. It's expected. And touch is very important, as we will see. posture and body orientation. So how we orient towards other people also tends to be a culturally determined thing. We don't, when we look at Western culture, we see that men tend to sit side by side in orientation, whereas in other cultures, men face to face to each other. And it really has to do with our cultural orientation about intimacy versus orientation or non-closeness, that is encouraged by Western culture between men. Okay. Extent of body touch, including what parts of the body are being touched. So an example of this, I think, too, is also what we would consider body exposure. So, for example, here in the United States or in Western culture, with the exception of some of the French culture and a little bit of the Portuguese culture, and I believe a little bit of the Italian culture, but don't quote me on that. Exposure of the female breast is not appropriate. Okay. But again, when we look at Portuguese and Spain, and there's a few others that I can't bring to mind, that tends to be normal within certain social situations. But when we get down to, for example, South America, especially in the Amazon area and areas within the southern areas of Africa, exposures of the breasts are a daily thing. They're not seen as shameful. Now, for the most part in Western culture, women can expose their belly area. We hear the term crop tops, I believe, is a term for it. But again, in some cultures, such as Eastern cultures, showing the belly area of a woman is the same as showing the breast area here in Western culture. So touch and including parts of the body tend to be a culturally based expectations. Okay. And this brings back a term that we talked about in the beginning of the semester about how we do cultural appropriation, how we view other cultures, because here in the United States, of course, we think people, societies who allow the woman to expose their breast area are inferior or they're less than or they're backwards is another term that can be used. And again, that's an example. If you engage in that kind of behavior, I'll use a term that might hurt a little bit, but that's an example of colonialization. When we look at different cultures who have different views of the body, different views of how to engage other people, intimate closeness versus distance, and when we are disgusted by that or think that that's wrong, that is a version of colonization, especially if you start making judgments based on that. So that's the context. Okay. Societies that are, and two kind of terms that we can use is homogeneous versus heterogeneous. Societies that are homogeneous, relatively simple, and where people have maintained good, long-standing relationships with each others. This is where we see more common, similar behaviors to each other. Okay. Where when we talk about the content of culture, everything is spelled out and said clearly and explicitly. So when we talk about context, it's kind of this expectation because of history with living with the people we live with. Content is everything is spelled out. And if you remember in the last section, we got into the conversation about indigenous psychology. Okay. Indigenous psychology really emphasizes the context of a culture, the way of that culture, how it has expressed itself over millennia, for example, and how the closeness of that community really defines the belief systems, the attitudes, and the ideas of that group. When we looking at the content of a culture, we're taking more of what you would consider a cross-culture Western perspective. So we're looking at, for example, what are the rules for people to live in Africa versus the rules, the explicit rules to live here in the United States? as an example. And we find, this comes from Fisk, reveals that there's four types of social patterns that exist across cultures, okay, that may exhibit themselves differently, but these are the four common patterns that we see. The first one is called what's called community sharing. This is where how the extent to which people know each other, how the family life is structured. And so this is kind of the closest metaphor to how people know each other. So if you look at, for example, Western culture, we're starting to become more and more distance from our what's called our nuclear family, which is the people we're biologically oriented to. And we're broadening our definition of family life to include others. Okay. And in this, we want to think about community sharing is what is mine, intimacy, oneness, cooperation. Who do we self-sacrifice for? And these tend to be the typical behaviors when we look at differences among community sharing among cultures. But we find community sharing existing in all cultures, and that's the point of these four patterns. There's just a different way of expression. In every society, we see some type of authority ranking. Okay, so this is again going back to the idea of obedience, admiration, giving and following orders without questioning our typical behaviors within a high authority society. Relationships between general and soldiers is kind of the closest metaphor, where in the army, people under a general do not question the general. Okay. And what's important to understand is that obedience is cross-culturally based. And this is probably obedience to authority, probably an area that has been studied really well using what's called the Milgram study paradigm. You probably heard this in Psych 101, or I've watched in the recent show that was put out, I believe, in 2018-19. But what Stanley Milgram did, just to kind of rehearse the research paradigm, is he advertised to the general population. He wanted everyday people to be a part of this experiment. And I'm giving this as the original, the way it was originally designed. And to help, the way it was advertised is to help science understand human learning. And it kind of explained that, we know that punishment works within the animal kingdoms with basically rats and pigeons and the like. But no studies have extended this to the human experience or the human experience to punishment. And so in the simple paradigm, when a participant walked into a room, there's going to be three individuals involved. One is going to be the teacher, represented by this T. The other is going to be a student, represented by this S. And the other one is going to be an authority. In the original research, this was a person in a gray lab coat. Okay. Now, the thing about this relationship is these two individuals are what you call confederates. They're people who are working for the experimenter. Okay. This is the condition that we're interested in. But when they come in, there's the teacher and the student figure, and they flip a rigged coin to where the participant will always be the teacher, and the confederate will always be the student. Okay. So let's take the teacher role. So they put the student into another separate room, and they do give the teacher a sample shock. This is the only real shock that is actually administered in the entire experiment. They shock the teacher with about 45 volts, just to kind of allow them to know how it feels. Okay. And then they put the teacher in front of a shock box. And the task is to learn some related words. So the first one is you learn a list of words like box, uh, talk, apple, orange, uh, um, car, boat. And then you go through the list again, and the teacher says the first word, and the student is supposed to match it with the word that was originally paired with it. Okay. Um, and when the student got it wrong, the teacher was supposed to flip a switch on this electric box. Okay. The electric box started with 15 volts and went clear up to 450 volts at increments of 15. So it would go 15, 30, 45, 60, all the way up to 450 volts. And at the end, it says XXX, extreme danger, can cause death, and the like. Okay. Now, originally, when Milgrams did this study, he went to psychiatrists and other psychologists, and he said, how many people would really go up to 450 volts? And the psychiatrists, at least here in the Western culture, said less than 1%. Um, and um, uh, that's what the experiment actually expected would occur. But what would happen is we'd start getting wrong questions, okay? And the teacher would look obviously stressed about it and would turn to the authority figure. And by this time, the student confederate is screaming, saying, "I have a heart condition. This hurts. Let me out. Let me out." And the teacher would go to the authority figure and say, "Hey, he wants to stop." And the authority figure would simply say, "It's imperative for you to continue with the experiment. Please continue, teacher." And at some points he would say, the teacher may ask, what about him? Who's responsible for this? And the authority figure again would say, "I take responsibility. Please continue on with the experiment. It's imperative that we finish." Now, to begin with, in the beginning, they were paid up front and they were told they could end the experiment at any time. Okay, regardless of what was happening. So how many people went all the way based on an ambivalent authority figure? Well, 67% did. All right. 67%, 2/3 of people went all the way. In fact, what we found with these experiments is you could get anywhere from 10% to 90%. 10% is when there was someone else in the room who stopped. Only 10% would go to 450 volts. If there was someone in the room that went up to 450 volts, 90% of the participants went up to 450 volts. When they were just alone, well, 2/3, 67% went up to 450 volts. Now, I always get asked, this was in the 1960s, and there were very huge ethical issues around it. Does this still happen today? There were some replications, 2015, 2018, that were done much more ethically. They knew full disclosure what they were going in up front, and still 67%. In fact, the 2008 study, it was actually 68%, would go all the way to 450 volts with just a ambivalent authority figure. Okay. Now they did do this within Western culture in different locations to see if the authority figure not being associated with a university but just a private company matters, and we got the same results. Now, what does this have to do with cross-cultural comparisons? Okay, is This research has been replicated in over 56 different countries. And in all 56 countries, we saw 2/3, if not higher rates of compliance to an authority figure going all the way up to 450%. Meaning that authority within a culture is a cross-cultural situation. And that authority figure has the ability to create things that can harm people or hopefully can use the same processes to improve people's lives. Okay. And that's why I bring up the Milgram study, because it was replicated across cultures. And we find the same consistent 2/3 mark across cultures. So there is no really culture that we have found so far that is immune to the influence of some type of authority figure, even when you don't know that authority figure. They're just there and stated they are. Okay. Now, the only adage to this is that remember that it starts with small incremental amounts. When Milgram said shock them with 450 volts, no one would do it. But the key was to start with 15 volts and slowly work up to the 450 volts. This is how things like governments being overthrown works. This is how violence in societies work within a culture, is they start with these small insults and they build and they build and they build until that charismatic authority figure then says, okay, it's time to, for example, take over the government or something like that, or hopefully do something positive, such as recognizing social wrongs. So I don't want to say authority figures are always bad. This paradigm can be used by authority figures to do positive changes in society or within that culture, I should say. But again, my point being with this pattern number 2, there seems to be no culture that is immune to the authority structure within that culture. And the other thing, so we mentioned authority figure. We also know that there's something called equality matching. Okay. This is social interaction, totally equal friends is the best metaphor. Okay. Typical behavior, taking turns, dividing things evenly, one person, one vote, and those types of things. Okay. When we talk about equality matching, we're not saying that within cultures there's different strata of individuals. What we're saying is, I'll use economic status as an example. Equality matching is matching low economic status individuals with other low economic status individuals, and vice versa for higher individuals in the economic status. We tend to share what we have with those that are within our same social economic status. We tend not to trade up or trade down. Okay. This can change between cultures. What I'm specifically talking about is Western culture on the stand of social economic status. In other cultures, it can be based on position within that culture. So whether you're the leader of the culture, whether you're male, female, and it can be divided among different lines. But we do see across cultures this equality matching based on similarities of individuals within that group. Okay. And going on with this social economic status, we also see a trend called market pricing. Okay. And that is social relationships are based on a cost benefit analysis. I'll be your friend if it pays to do so. Okay. This is kind of that mental bartering. I will go into a social relationship if it has some benefit to me. Now, the mistake that is often made in this is confusing market price with money. Okay. This may not have anything to do with money. It may be emotional support, for example. It may be protection within a community, as an example. It may be, something as simple as you bring the guacamole and I'll bring the chips type of interaction. Okay. So, and we see this type of either psychologically or commodity interaction within every society that we've studied so far. Okay. And we can even extend this to outside entities. So, if we look back again, Native American culture, there were trade routes that were extensive and complex that trade occurred intertribal. So the reason I bring that up is it's a myth that colonizing white people brought trade to the Americas. There was actually very complex trading relationships that already existed. Okay, I'm going to kind of end with this idea because I've thrown a lot at you for today. One of the most basic paradigms that we study across cultures, and I believe I mentioned this before, is the collectivist versus individualist. Okay. As we have said again and again in this class, the continuum provides a parsimonious yet highly predictive cultural relevant construct to understanding all sorts of behaviors and patterns. So with that in mind, and I'm not going to go over, if you remember, collectivist is my success and failures are my communities, and my community's success and failures are mine. Individualistic is I make my own success and failures independent of my community. Okay. And so what I'd like to go into next time is some physical aspects of our social world, such as attractiveness and perceptions of attractiveness. And as this is saying right here, cultural differences in attractiveness can be cross culture. And the reason why I want to spend a little bit more time on this is I need to go back and do a little bit more research. To be honest with you, yes, your professors don't know everything when they're going into a lecture, because traditionally, when we've talked about attractiveness, we've talked about the universality of attractiveness, that we assume that there's certain facial features, there's certain eye sets, there's certain ways that are cross cultures that do not have cultural boundaries. But since perception has been studied so well over about the last 14 years, we've had to change our ideas about the universality of attractiveness. So I want to go back and look at some research before I do this part of the lecture. So I hope you don't mind us ending a little bit early for this week. Maybe use the rest of the time to work on your